Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Glad to be here.
Give everybody what I like to call the state of the state. Tell us where you're at today, what your role is, and what your world is generally like, and then we'll go back and hit the early days and find out where you came from.
I am based in Atlanta. Mixing is kind of what I do a lot of, but I bounce around. I do live front of house. I do a lot of work with houses of worship and churches. Mixing, I do a lot of training and consulting. And then, the big thing I'm really trying to get going is the whole Dolby ATMOS stuff, because I love working in Atmos.
The church thing, I feel, is one of those audio diversification things that I think a lot of people don't think about, regardless of your religious affiliation or perspective. They need audio at churches, and we all have that talent as audio professionals. And I think in the spirit of diversification, it's an overlooked idea sometimes.
Yeah, I had never planned on getting into doing church audio. I had the drummer in my band was inviting me to his church, and it took him a year, and I finally checked it out and met a bunch of people there and got to be friends, and I started playing in the band and just helping out where I could. And I never told anybody I was an engineer. And eventually word got around and they ended up hiring me. And that was back when I was in Chicago. That was never part of the plan for me originally. But that, I feel like, has been sort of my story anyways. Like none of it was planned.
Yeah.
Seems
well,
like.
Let's go back and trace the story a bit. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Chicago. I was born in Chicago and was in the northwest suburbs for most of my life. And after college, we lived in Chicago a little bit and bounced around all over the place.
When you were growing up, was there an influence of music or technology in your life?
I was really big into movies. And I actually ended up as a film major in college. Like, I think music was important to me, but I don't think I ever realized how important it was. If I really think back, I remember music from a very early age. I remember like the early days of MTV, and we weren't allowed to watch MTV. I remember when that first came on, but we could watch like Friday night videos, I think was a thing, and we would record that on the VCR and play that back. And there were videos on after school. And I remember getting a boombox, around 5th grade. And, so there was always a lot of music, and I was always listening to music. When I was in high school, I got involved in theater, just doing tech stuff. And I ended up being put in charge of the audio. So that was kind of my first foray into doing any kind of audio production. We didn't know what we were doing back then. And especially considering, there were no resources really available. I think at some point they brought in maybe an AV contractor or consultant. And I remember him telling us a few things and giving us some ideas. That was kind of one of my earliest forays into sort of surround sound and immersive, because we used to put speakers around the theater to like fire sound effects from different places. We did the musical Brigadoon, and they had like a bridge like that went out into the audience, and it was supposed to be over a creek. So I had put a speaker under the bridge and had like creek sound effects coming from under that. That was really where like actually doing audio stuff started. Music didn't happen until college for me, really, where I started playing guitar and playing in bands and doing that kind of stuff. But I was in piano lessons for a little bit, but I didn't really appreciate it at the time. And it's one of the regrets I have was I took piano lessons for a year in the 6th grade, I think, and I didn't realize I probably should have kept at it because I never used to practice, and my teacher, she couldn't tell. And that should have maybe been a signal to me that I might have a knack for this.
Yeah.
But, it had been something that I was forced to take piano lessons. And when people force me to do things, I don't necessarily enjoy doing them, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's true for most of us when we're forced to do something. Yeah. Tell me about your college years and tell me also about when did audio really enter the picture, professionally speaking?
So I went to Northwestern University as a film major in college, and somewhere in my sophomore year, like since I had a quote unquote audio background from high school, it was more experience than anybody else did. And most film majors, they are not interested in sound. And since I had a little bit of experience with it, people were asking me to help out with the audio on their projects. And at some point, I think in maybe my sophomore year, I finally said, okay, fine, I get it. I'll focus more on the audio side of things. That was also when I had started playing in bands. And so I ended up interning at a recording studio in Chicago. Must have been in this like the spring of my junior year, and I did that part-time for 6 months. And when that internship kind of ended in the fall of my senior year, I started doing audio editing as like a part-time job. I've been getting paid to do it ever since. As soon as I got out of school, I was working for a company. We were doing like it's like corporate training videos. And so I was doing a lot of voiceover recording. I was actually composing music for some of those videos at the time. They had a little studio there. I look back on it and I'm kind of amazed that I got hired into that position right out of college to begin with. I must have been the lowest, like when they were asking how much money do you want, I figure I must have been the lowest there, but I don't know. But that was kind of how it started. And, I just kind of went from there, I guess.
When you were editing then, that was tape, I assume.
When I had an internship, I don't know, 96, 97, around there. So some of the projects we were doing were on 2-inch. Some of them were digital. We had a whole bunch of ADATs. I was learning Pro Tools at the time because we had Pro Tools at school. So I got exposed to all of that stuff all at once. When I started editing, it was digital. And even at the time, it was hard because when I had that part-time job, the software I was editing in, it was a video editing platform, but it was like an audiobook kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And you only have, it's like a 30 frames per second. Like that's the only places you can chop, which made editing audio kind of interesting at times to not have it like it's the kind of stuff to me. I think if I went back and listened to that stuff right now, I would really cringe at some of the cuts because there was no way to really like crossfade things. Mm-hmm. It was just, and it was a lot of like taking out uhs and ums and stutters and things like that. And I actually ended up working for that client for a long time through that company. It was the American Academy of Dermatology. So it was like they would get like 2 doctors in a room. They would record these at their annual conferences. And they get 2 doctors in a room and they would basically talk dermatology. And a lot of times it would be like if someone was a conference presenter, they would basically take their talk and sort of turn it into interview format. But I would go through and I would clean them up so that they sounded smart because, they would be, lots of uhs and stutters and all that kind of stuff.
You make the doctors sound smart?
Yeah, that was my job. Make them sound as smart as they actually are.
To this day, I'm intrigued to no end by corporate audio work. It pays so much more than music in most cases. And it's so commonplace. Like, it's happening all the time because whether we realize it or not, people need our skills.
Yeah, I mean, it's not glamorous at all. And
No.
I've seen things like going to those conferences because I ended up going and starting to record some of that stuff. And I've seen things that I can never unsee from those, walking across like the show floor at those conferences and some of the exhibits. I wouldn't have made it as a dermatologist. I know that.
How long did this gig last?
Well, I worked there until I graduated, and then I went to another company for about a year, corporate training video kind of stuff, training videos for it was like copiers and fax machines and things like that. After about a year, I went back to the company that I'd worked part-time for when I was in school, because when I graduated, he just didn't have enough work for me. And I went back to work there, and I was there for, 4 or 5 years after that.
Were you making any records at that point? And if not, did you have a desire to do so?
Yeah, well, I was playing in my band, and that was a big focus for me at the time, was trying to do something with music that way. We were recording here and there, and every once in a while I was helping somebody out with recording, but I would say probably the most of what I was doing music-wise was my own stuff at the time, and recording, playing in bars and clubs and that kind of stuff around Chicago.
Did you have any kind of recording set up at home?
At some point, I had picked up like a 001 and some monitors, 'cause when I really started digging in on trying to make my record, I had got some stuff to do a little bit of work at home. And so when I did that record, I bounced around between where I was working, doing some stuff at home. We recorded in a couple of other studios. I mean, that album, I think I recorded it 3 times, basically, because it was like, we recorded at the really cheap studio. Those sessions didn't turn out. And then we worked at another studio where quality was okay, but the performances weren't quite right. And then we went somewhere else and finally started getting it right. So it was a pretty big learning experience making that album for me.
How old were you then?
It's probably mid-20s. I was told there'd be no math.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll omit any more math questions. Did you have ambitions of a particular career in mind?
I think I wanted to be Bruce Springsteen. I wanted to be the rock star. When I was doing, I was doing a little bit of commercials and some TV, some radio stuff at the company I was at the time. I think from a professional standpoint, for the audio side of things, I wanted to get more into doing the kind of broadcast stuff versus the corporate videos. Like, that seemed like it would be a little bit like, I don't know, maybe prestigious, I guess. I didn't really want to go to LA at the time, which is where a lot of the people I knew from film school went out to LA. I wanted to stay in Chicago, and Chicago at the time was a big advertising city. So I wanted to probably do more of that kind of stuff at the time. So I had that kind of rolling around in the back of my mind, but really, I still had like the music dreams of actually going and playing and doing that kind of stuff.
How long did that ambition last?
I put out my record in 2002, and about a year after that, maybe 9 months or so, I moved over to a company in downtown Chicago, right off of Michigan Avenue, that was doing more of the kind of TV stuff and broadcast stuff. So I kind of burned out on the music side of things, not as much the playing and performing. It was just more like I was booking all the gigs. and trying to do the marketing side of things. And, if we were doing a show, it was like, I've got 3 guitars I'm bringing in and, an amp and pedal board and then all the merch. And then sometimes we'd be playing, I'd be bringing in a PA and just all of that extra stuff. I kind of burned out on doing that because I just wanted to play, really. So there was a company in Chicago who I had talked to maybe a year before. They called me because they needed somebody. They had a main engineer. They had an opening for another engineer. And I was so good with Pro Tools and really fast. And that was like, it ended up being a lot of audiobooks that I was doing there, but also did some stuff for like Discovery Channel, Home and Garden TV. If the main engineer wasn't available, I would mix episodes for that kind of stuff, spotting sound effects here and there, music, that kind of stuff. It made it easier for me because they had called me. It was more the stuff that I, at the time, thought I wanted to work on. Kind of the stuff, it's like, it's nice to be able to say to your parents, like, hey, the show that I worked on is going to be on TV at 6 o'clock on Saturday night or 7 o'clock on Saturday night, and then they can watch it, or you can say that to friends. I mean, it was pre-Facebook days, but I'm sure, if that had been around at the time, I would have been telling everybody about that stuff. And, it was nice to be able to do that. But the work for me, it's audio. Like, I just like doing audio. It didn't necessarily feel more important, I guess. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it. In a lot of ways, it was the same as kind of what I had been doing, if that makes sense.
I realized that, because I've had those same aspirations of wanting to be a rock star. So I think inherently we might have that desire to have recognition. And I'm wondering if you were starting to look at audio and, working on, Discovery Channel, HGTV, like, was it important to you to get recognition for that, or was it just work?
That might have factored in to things. Mm-hmm. We used to get really angry, like, in the company, because at the time they weren't putting credits on the episodes. It was almost like there were production companies that did the work and that they had farmed it out to the company I worked for. Because we did, like, one of the shows we were working on, New Spaces, we were doing everything on that. Like, it was our producers, it was our camera people, video editors, all the audio. We were doing all of that kind of stuff. But then it was still going to, I think it might have been Scripps. And then Scripps, maybe they were selling the show to HGTV.
Yeah, I've heard, and I cannot remember who the guest was, but I have heard of incidents of this where people would work on shows like that, not get the credit because of the way the deals were structured.
All the guys I work with, nobody was happy about it, but
yeah,
that was the way it was.
What came next?
I was working, it was like downtown Chicago. I'm right off of Michigan Avenue. It's, feels cool to be doing that. But I was commuting from the suburbs, and it would be, it was like 45 minutes to an hour on the train. And this is one way. And then I would get on a bus from Union Station to go over to Michigan Avenue. So, it'd be another 20 minutes on the bus a lot of the time. Going home in the afternoon, the train would be even longer because you didn't have the express trains. I was commuting around 3 hours every day. And then on top of, if you think about just being in production, it's not always a 9 to 5, as most people listening to this would know. So some of those days, like, if I had to work late, your number of train options, they just shrink the later in the day it gets. So that really started to wear on me, that commute over time. And in the meantime, like, the drummer in my band, he had been inviting me to come to his church. And, I used to look at these big churches and go, nah, those are cults. I'm not interested. in that. But I finally went and met some people there. Like he took me to, I guess they call it was like a small group, and we were just hanging out and talking. And like the associate music director, or assistant music director, he was in that group. So I met him, and eventually I started attending and started playing in the band. And I got to be friends with a lot of people over there. And when they heard I was an audio engineer and they didn't have anybody on staff at the time, so the option for me, I was looking at it was like, it's like, okay, I can keep going downtown and working on this stuff that probably would look better on a resume, or I could go and work with my friends every day and only commute 20 minutes one way. And I kind of said, you know what? I think I'd rather work with my friends. At the time, I was nervous about doing that because I think the kind of modern churches today, they're looked at differently from a production standpoint than they were at the time. So going over there, I was nervous because I didn't know, like, well, where would I go next from this? And I remember that was even something they were asking me in the interview, was like, you sure you want to do this? Because this isn't, a prestige position, but I was more interested in working with my friends, I think. That was something that, when I had worked at the company at Ian Ryan right out of college, when I was there for, 5 years, I was friends with everybody there. And that was something that, like, when I was working downtown, like, it was great people I was working with. But since everybody was kind of commuting in to get there, I feel like everybody kind of wanted to come in, do their work, and get out. And you didn't have that kind of communal thing in the same way that I had. And that was something that I missed. So I said, you know what? I'm going to go over here and give this a try. I took the job at a church out in like the western suburbs of Chicago, which I never imagined I would ever do. And that moved me into doing live sound, which I hadn't really done since high school. I had tried doing live sound a little bit in college. There was a band I was friends with, and I used to guitar tech for them. And they were playing at a club one time, and I was like, and I talked them into letting me mix that day. And I was like skinny college kid at the time, and I feel like the house engineer, he probably took one look at me and he really rolled his eyes, and maybe he didn't actually do it, but in his brain he was going, oh yeah, let's see how this goes. I'm in there doing all right, mixing the show, and I don't know, 4 or 5 songs in, I kind of leaned forward, and they had some graphic EQs in the rack for all the monitor wedges. And when I leaned forward, I I hit them with my knees and brought them to the roof on that piece of gear. So Feedback City right away. I had no idea how to handle that. There were no lights, because the rack lights, of course, are burned out on the rack underneath, and I didn't know how to fix this. So I literally stopped the show for those guys. The name of the band was Hello Dave. The whole way they had gotten their name was when they were in college, they had a sound guy whose name was Dave, and he wasn't all there. So a lot of the time it was, hello, Dave. So as the show is stopped, and I'm kind of frantically looking around to try and find the house guy to see where he went so that he can help me on this, my friend Mike, the lead singer of the band, took it upon himself to tell the story of his band's name right at that moment. So as I'm walking like through this crowded club trying to find the house guy, all these people are asking me, "Are you Dave? Are you Dave?" It was years before I wanted to do any live sound again after that. It was probably 6 or 7 years before I finally was like, okay, I'll give this a try again.
The PTSD from that.
Yeah, I think I'll stick to the studio.
Okay, but the show went on, right?
Yeah, they got it back on track and it went on, and I kept mixing the rest of the night. You know, I was a little frazzled, but
you kept your knees away from those graphic EQs.
Oh yeah. And learned the importance of having a flashlight on gigs.
Let's continue. Tell me more.
When I started working for the church, I actually started really learning things. They had just built that auditorium that I was put in charge of, and it was probably about 1,500 seats. The PA had been value engineered, I guess is the best way to describe it. And part of why I had been hired was because they just weren't getting what they wanted out of it. And I kind of came in. So eventually I brought in an AV company based out of Atlanta called Clark Pro Audio at the time, or Clark Pro Media, I think. And they came in and kind of explained about the sound system and what we really needed to do. They ended up changing out the PA there, and once that was changed, like everything was massively better. Through that, I kind of started I started hearing about this church in Atlanta called North Point Community Church. One of the guys at Clark who I was friends with, he was always talking about North Point. So at some point, my cousin, he had moved to Atlanta, he was getting married, and I said, we're going to that wedding because then I can go and check out this North Point place that everybody is talking about. So we came down, it must have been like the spring of '06 for the wedding. It was like sonically, it was what I wanted to be doing. I mean, like, you know, the kick drum was hitting me in the chest, and it was guitars, and it was not the church music that a lot of people would think of. It was it was a rock show. I got a tour of the place. My wife was awesome because she went along for the whole ride because we were there all morning, going all over the place. I met a whole bunch of people, and they had 2 big auditoriums. I had met a bunch of the guys on staff there. I had met their audio director. I was asking him, like, well, how do you do staff here? And he was saying, you know, there's him, and then he usually had like a assistant engineer, like a second engineer with him. And I was just looking around at the size of the place, and I was going, I could be a second engineer in a place like this. I mean, that would be pretty cool. And so when I went back to Chicago, I emailed everybody to say thanks for taking the time. In one of the emails, I think I might have just said, like, hey, by the way, you know, if you're ever looking for people, let me know. And I think my buddy Chris Briley now, who was the audio director there at the time, I think he said, you know, it's funny you should mention that, because someone had just left and they were opening another campus and people were moving around, and I ended up going down there and interviewing and ended up as the audio director at North Point. And I did that for 9 years. I had 2 auditoriums. You know, the main auditorium was, I think it was 2,500 seats. And then we had another auditorium that was like another 2,000 seats. Those rooms, they were about 200 feet wide by 100 feet deep. Equipment, it was all tour grade. The bands, it was a lot of session players. There would be Sundays I would look up on stage and it would be like, okay, he was signed to Interscope at one time and he was touring with another signed band and he just played on a single. And it was a very different environment from what I was used to in Chicago. Just the level of the players and everything that was happening there, and just the focus of what they were trying to do. Like North Point had been created to be a church for the unchurched. So it was all about trying to have a place where you could invite your friends and it wouldn't be weird. and it wouldn't feel churchy. And I loved it. Light shows and big screen, big PAs, drums, guitars. It was cool.
How did your personal beliefs align with this place?
They were right in line. Like, I loved what they were trying to do.
Okay.
So that was a big part of it. Like, I don't think I understood when I was going down there that they were one of the largest churches in the country at the time, and one of the, the most influential churches at the time. I think I learned that, like, over the first year or so. All I was thinking was, musically, this makes a whole lot more sense. Like, the church I was at in Chicago, we would have, I'd have like 8 or 10 singers on stage at one time. And the music it just wasn't where I had come from. When I went down to Atlanta, it was like, you'd have a lead vocal and maybe a couple of harmonies, and they were actually harmonies. It wasn't everybody singing all the time, and the musicians were playing parts. We had amp ISO cabinets in the back, so everybody had their amps in back, and we were turning them up to where you could get the tone. There was a Leslie back there because we had a real B3. It was kind of more of what I was used to from a musical standpoint of playing in bands and having the rock show, and just now it was a church. I watch movies and they show churches, and I'm like, yeah, that's not really what churches are like anymore. They're, there are still churches out there like that, but this was more, it was a rock show in a church.
It's like a Vegas residency is what it is in some respects.
Yeah. And the treat, we had acoustic treatment in the place. So it was kind of like, it was almost like working in a studio. A lot of the same stuff all week long. There were pieces of gear that I could probably use that someone wouldn't take out on the road because they'd be getting bounced around in a truck. And the room was treated, and, the PA, eventually ended up putting in Meyer PAs there, and it was great. It was as close to mixing in a studio that live sound, I think, can get.
Yeah.
At the time was like that. And I've been in a lot more churches since then where it's very similar to that, which makes sense given how influential North Point was.
That lasted 9 years. What was the cause of you moving on from that?
I think I just been there long enough. 9 years of doing the same thing, and I was ready for a change. The team I had been on when I started there, like, everybody had just about moved on. Since then, we'd gone through leadership changes above me and things like that. And it was, it was just a different place, and not in a bad way or anything. It was just different. And I was, just about 10 years older at the time. And I was ready to do something a little bit different because, it was a lot of the same stuff. And, things would change week to week because you always had new musicians coming in. We always had, new music we were doing. A lot of the music we were doing, we would do kind of like opening songs for the services. A lot of times they were just kind of mainstream commercial songs. Like, I mixed everything from jazz to blues to R&B, and it could be anything from like Van Halen to like there was a song we did, it was like by Saliva at some point. But, also like Earth, Wind and Fire and lots of classics, Bon Jovi, it was usually songs people knew.
Let me ask you about that transition, though, before we move on from this. You and your wife left Chicago to come to Atlanta. Mm-hmm. In a nutshell, was that a cultural shock to you, or did it feel normal? because you were from the suburbs of Chicago.
It's different here for sure. It's, we've been down here about 20 years now, so I'm kind of used to the culture, but I still go back to Chicago once or twice a year because my family's still up there. And it is a very different culture here. I think people in Chicago are a little more direct at times in how they are feeling.
Yeah.
People are a little more reserved here sometimes.
Let's talk about post North Point.
When I left North Point, I was doing some consulting and training for other churches. I've been training audio engineers for a very long time. That was part of my job at North Point. When I was at North Point, I had 24 engineers under me that were a mix of staff and contract guys. We also had a broadcast studio that I was overseeing for a while when I was there. So I was used to kind of teaching and training, and I had been writing a blog, I guess, the whole time I was at North Point. And so a lot of people in that kind of house of worship arena, they knew who I was, and I would get asked to come and train and help them with sound, but it was always really hard for me to do that when I was on staff. So when I left the staff, that was one of the first big things I started doing. There was a church in South Florida. They started flying me down a couple of times a month to mix. So I did fly dates down there for, 3-4 years, maybe longer. So it was a mix of that. And then I slowly started getting the studio side of things going again. Doing, I guess it was a lot more post stuff early on, doing video work and mostly churches, and started doing some stuff with nonprofits, things like that. So, and a lot of it was just through contacts I made at North Point. So former staff members who had been there, who had left and gone on to do their own things. I still work with a lot of those folks. And that was hard for me just because I had always been on staff. Like, I always had a staff job up until I left. When I was in Chicago, I was always on staff somewhere. I might do a little freelance thing here and there every once in a while, but I was used to being on staff. And that was the first time I was completely independent, having to deal with that. That was a pretty big learning curve. I'd say it still is a learning curve in a lot of ways. I kind of prefer working for clients, is one of the things that I sort of discovered through that whole journey. When I was in Chicago, before I started working for houses of worship, I would be on staff somewhere, but we always had clients that we were working for. I always liked taking care of clients. And when you go on staff at a church, like, the church is kind of your client, but it's also not. It's hard to explain the ownership sense that you get when you're actually in there, whereas when you're just doing stuff for clients, it's like it's their project. When I'm on staff at a church, it's kind of my project. Someone else on staff probably came up with a lot of the ideas, and the work I'm doing is there to serve their vision and what they wanted to do, but at the same time, it's also kind of my thing in a way, or at least that's the way my brain works. When I moved out of that and went back into just working for clients, I feel guilty in a lot of ways because sometimes it was just way easier. Like, a lot of the time it was way easier. Maybe it was working in retail in college a little bit and having that kind of customer service mentality, or, all the part-time jobs and things like that growing up. But that's more kind of the way I'm wired, I think, is to take care of other people and work on other projects.
What are the challenges for you in worship audio? Where does it become difficult?
A lot of times the music directors and worship directors, they don't necessarily have an arrangement background, and then they've been put in charge of that kind of stuff. So you end up with a lot of people playing on top of each other. And sometimes that's part of the sound that, they're going for. But I had to learn how to get separation in things and to sort of pull things apart a lot. We used to do a thing at North Point they called Concert on the Lawn, where they would bring in a big stage and a big PA and set up out on the lawn in front of the church. And it was kind of an outreach event, and all the music that they would do was, it was mainstream music. There was no church music at all. And I just remember going into a rehearsal for that, and it was all the same guys I was used to working with. It was like push the faders up and there it is. And I couldn't understand why was this so much easier than doing the stuff that we do on Sundays. And a big part of it, I think, was there was an actual arrangement there. And those guys, it was always pro musicians, and they just came in and played the parts and nailed them, and it was great. So that's one of the biggest things, is definitely on the arrangement side, I think. Talent-wise, for me, it's always been great here in Atlanta. I'm always working with great musicians. When I go and help out at other churches, the talent level isn't necessarily the same, especially if I'm in a smaller town. It's a lot of volunteers playing music. So having to figure out, like, what do you feature, and maybe what are the things that you need to kind of hide a little bit more in the mix? That's a big part of it. That's something a lot of times why I prefer going someplace to help with training is because then we get to work with their actual musicians. Like if I were to bring people here and use the tracks that I've recorded from churches, it's too good. Like sometimes, it's a different thing than some of these churches where the talent level, it's not quite there all the time. I feel like it has gotten a lot better over the last 10 to 15 years or so. But, these are not session players. So there's definitely that. And then on top of all that, you have the acoustics of the room, just like the live sound nature of things, where you might have a PA that isn't necessarily the right PA for the room, or a PA that hasn't been like configured or tuned properly for the room. A lot of times when I go places, that's the first thing I'm looking at is, can we improve the sound system without changing any gear? Just let me retune some things and see what happens. It's a lot of that. And then just in general, you've got a lot of people involved in those organizations. Sometimes there can be politics that you have to deal with. Not really my thing. Like one of the things I really liked about North Point was there wasn't a ton of politics internally when I was there. The level of drama was pretty low, whereas I go other places sometimes and I can tell that there's other stuff behind the scenes, and sometimes I have to help coach on dealing with some of that to get everybody to talk to. I mean, it used to be for a long time when I would go into churches, there was like this divide between the production team and the music team, whereas everybody really needs to work together. And for me, having been a musician and doing the production side of things, it's easy for me to kind of go between those two worlds. I can talk to production people in their language, and I can talk to musicians in our language. And it's been real helpful, I think, to have that skill set.
What's the tolerance for spending to get the right gear, the right results, the right, hey, we got to put some money into acoustics. We have to get a smart system in here to tune the room, blah, blah, blah. Like, what is that like? Does it vary church by church?
Yeah, it really varies church by church. where I was at, North Point's whole thing was other churches aren't our competition. Our competition is, it's the big game. It's the movie theater up the street. It's the lake. It's all these other things that are sort of pulling at people's attention to go and do. We had a high priority on a high production level because that was the stuff we were competing against. Other churches don't necessarily look at it that way all the time.
So North Point sounds like they were looking at it from an entertainment perspective.
We weren't trying to be entertainment. Years ago, like when I was doing more post stuff, the Discovery Channel for a long time had the strictest audio specs for delivery. Now a lot of this stuff is a lot more standardized, but back then they were really picky about audio because they had done studies that found the reason most people change the channel is because of the audio quality. Like it's not because of bad camera work and things being shaky. It's when the audio is off. And, even if you think about YouTube videos today and TikTok and all that kind of stuff, like what people are usually willing to watch, if the audio is bad, though, it's easier for them to turn the channel or to go look at something else, I think. So that was something that I always had in the back of my mind, and it was kind of in the values at North Point was we need to do this at a high level because it matters. People might not necessarily say we're leaving because of the quality. You're driving down the street and you've got two options for restaurants to go to. Is the one that looks like a dive that you've never been in? Are you going to pick that one, or are you going to pick the one that looks nicer, even if it's the same kind of food? It's like you usually pick the nicer one right off the bat. The other one might have better food. From the standpoint of just attracting people to come in, you want to create a good first impression. I think a lot more churches are understanding that now, but there's a balance between what they're trying to do and from a ministry standpoint, and then still having something that people are willing to sit through. Speech and spoken word is such a big part of what all the churches are doing. If you go into a room that's really echoey and muffled and you can't understand the person talking, how long are you going to suffer that before you just go find somewhere else? And the other thing today is so many churches have gone online. If you're just interested in content, well, you can get the content anywhere. Do you want to listen to somebody sound echoey in person when you could just listen to the podcast of it on Monday morning?
Interesting. Huh. This might come off as an odd question, but is there room for an atheist to be an audio professional at a church?
Yeah, I think so. It would depend on the church. There are some churches, they're not going to hire somebody who's not a believer, even as a contractor. But some of the churches I've worked with, they kind of see it as an outreach thing. I don't know that they would necessarily be preaching directly to that person to try and convert them. I mean, there are some churches they probably, unfortunately, I think, to me, they would be doing that. I think they would allow it. I mean, I know that there are churches where they're hiring musicians to come in and play, and some of those guys are not necessarily believers. I think most churches would prefer to have somebody who is on board with what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think an atheist could definitely go in there. Agnostics for sure. But at the same time, I kind of wonder how many people who aren't believers would want to do that in the first place.
I could have an absolute love of audio and be a complete badass at what they do and come in and just rock it for those churches. But maybe they're not a believer.
Like, I would be okay with that. If I was still on staff and somebody came in and they were a killer engineer and they wanted to, they wanted a contract there, like, yeah, I would definitely be open to it. But I don't know that every church would. I've contracted for churches and I've had to stop because sometimes some of the stuff that they would say from the platform, I just didn't agree with it. I can't in my heart make this happen. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, I might have loved like the band and working with them, but just, some of the stuff that they would say, it's like, there's a lot of theological debate amongst churches, and I've bounced around to so many of them around the country now. There's things that one church thinks are written in stone. I know other churches that would debate that, and it goes through my mind sometimes when I'm going into places to help out. I'm probably a little more progressive than some people who do what I do.
Sure.
And definitely open to a lot more things.
Personally, I have no interest in it, but I ask for those that are wondering that who would be watching. My own personal experience. I mean, I got burned out on the church thing long ago as a kid when, the minute they started to go into, the whole satanic panic thing of the 80s and talk about how rock and roll is the devil's music, I was like, these people have lost the plot. I'm out of here. And that was the end of that.
I don't want to get political, but I look around right now and I kind of feel like there are definitely some people who have lost the plot.
Yeah.
So,
regardless of what your religious affiliation is, I think that house of worship or worship sound, whatever the proper phrase would be, it's a needed thing in many communities. And it's, like I said, when we first started, I do think it's an overlooked job possibility if you have the skills and you want to go and work in that world. And clearly, I mean, you worked there at North Point for 9 years, so clearly there are possibilities where one can make a living.
Oh yeah, and I was on staff there for 9 years. I still contract for them regularly. Like, there's one of my biggest clients.
And I don't want to neglect this because this is one of the commonalities you and I have, other than just audio in general, but Atmos. It's an interest of yours. It's something that you and I are in an Atmos group together with a group of folks. Does Atmos have a place in church sound, in worship audio, in any of that?
I think it could. Like, we're so early in this, I feel like, you and I, on the music side of things. I think the broadcast side of Atmos is still kind of growing. And, the other thing too is just with like streaming online. Mm-hmm. Like I am really I really wish YouTube would add Atmos, because like, to me, that's a bigger deal than Spotify. Like, I think more people listen to music on YouTube than they do on Spotify, last time I checked. I could be wrong on that. So having immersive audio on Spotify, or having it on Spotify would be awesome. I think we would all agree. But having it on YouTube, I think that would open up a lot more possibilities. And it would be helpful in a sense of, a lot of churches have been going online and putting their services online, to give that feeling like you're in the room. You can get a lot closer to that when you are working in Atmos or an immersive format than you can in just stereo. And that's one of the things I like about Atmos, is just like, coming from a live sound background, when I'm working in Atmos, it feels a lot more like I am in a room, but now I have control over things in ways that I wouldn't necessarily in the live space. I mean, I got drawn into Atmos. Well, I've been a surround sound junkie for years and years, but the thing that really hit me the first time I heard it in a studio was, it reminded me, years and years ago, we played at the House of Blues in Chicago, and I had like these awesome wedges, backline that was great. There were side fills. The monitor engineer was awesome. And I just remember being on that being on that stage and being engulfed in the music. And it just felt so right. And when I heard Atmos, I was like, there it is, like music wise. And I've been listening to surround sound stuff for years, but there was something with hearing Atmos, and I just said, I need to do this. I'd wanted to work in surround probably my entire career, and I always missed it, because like when I was doing the TV stuff in Chicago, everything was still analog for broadcast, so surround wasn't really a big deal at the time. And then I moved into the House of Worship side, and all the broadcast stuff we did for that was only stereo. So I kind of was like, I need to try and do this now, or I'm never going to do this. So I took the risk and put it in.
It was you that helped me get situated with streaming Apple Music through my system a few years ago.
Like, I found that by accident.
Yeah. And once I figured that out, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to leave this room.
And like when people come over now and listen to it, they're like, I would never leave. My wife will tell you, I spend most of my time in here. So
I will put links in the show notes to the relevant things, website, of course, and social media, so people can check you out. And this has been great, because I did not have a clue that this was your world or had been your history. And
cool.
It's fascinating to hear about it. So I appreciate you making time for me today. And thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to come on, Matt. Really appreciate it.
All right, Dave, you take care.